Payback times.
The first thing I noticed was the coffee. Not my mother's coffee. The thin, almost translucent brew she'd been making since before I was born. Strained through a cloth filter her own mother had brought from Krakow. This was something darker, richer, the kind that came from a proper machine with a reservoir and a programmed cycle. The smell hit me the moment I pushed open the front door of Ashgrove Manor with my shoulder, the way I'd been doing since I was 9 years old, and the latch had been stiff. I stood in the entryway with my weekend bag still in my hand, and let my senses do their inventory. 25 years of walking into contested spaces had made this automatic. The smell of someone else's coffee in my mother's kitchen. A man's wool blazer, charcoal, good cut, hung too neatly on the hook by the hall mirror where my mother kept her collection of embroidered tote bags. A pair of leather Oxfords aligned on the mat beside the door, not kicked off, but placed with intention. Someone who wanted you to see that they had made themselves comfortable while still appearing considerate. My mother had not mentioned anyone was staying with her. I set my bag down and walked toward the kitchen, following the sound of a cabinet door closing. He was standing at the far counter with his back to me, and even from behind I could read the posture. Relaxed, proprietary, a man who had done this 100 times. He was perhaps 60, trim, silver at the temples, with the kind of tan that came from deliberate maintenance rather than outdoor labor. When he heard my footsteps on the old oak floor, he turned without surprise, unhurried, as though he'd expected me, or perhaps as though my arrival in my own family's kitchen were simply a minor development in his day. In his hand was a manila folder, cream-colored, letter-sized. My eyes went to the drawer that was still open beside him, not the junk drawer by the sink, not the silverware drawer, but the deep side drawer to the left of the refrigerator. The one my mother had always used for important papers. Tax documents, insurance cards, the original deed to the house. I had grown up in this kitchen for 18 years, and I had never once seen a guest open that drawer. I hadn't opened that drawer myself without being asked. "You must be Renata." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without being mechanical. "Your mother speaks so highly of you. I've been looking forward to meeting you." I crossed the kitchen and offered my hand because I needed him to feel that I was ordinary. "I'm sorry, I don't think I—" Dorian Hale. He shook my hand with both of his, a warmth escalation that took 2 seconds and was entirely calculated. "I'm an old friend of your mother's, and her financial advisor. In a small way. I've been helping Elżbieta organize her affairs. She has so much on her plate, as I'm sure you know, and she likes to have things in order. Elżbieta, not your mother, not Mrs. Szymańska. Elżbieta, spoken with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had earned the right and wanted you to know it." He set the folder on the counter without closing it and moved to the coffee machine. "Can I get you a cup? I brought beans from a place I like in Hartford. Your mother's been enjoying it. Your mother's been enjoying it." I looked at the folder. He hadn't closed it, but he'd angled it enough that I couldn't read the tab. I looked at his coffee mug on the drying rack, bone white, no logo, already washed and waiting. I looked at the blazer in the hallway, the shoes on the mat, the proprietary ease with which this man had just offered me coffee in my mother's kitchen from beans he'd imported from Hartford. "I have seen you before," I thought. Not you specifically, but everything you are. I'd love a cup, I said. Where's my mother? Sunroom. He was already pouring. She had a slow morning. Some days are better than others. I told her not to rush. You'd find your way. I told her not to rush. I watched him pour, and I kept my face pleasant and open. And I thought, you're 3 weeks into this dynamic with me, and you're already intercepting her communications and setting the terms of her day. I'll go say hello, I said. I took the coffee because refusing it would signal something, and I walked to the sunroom. My mother was in the wing-back chair by the window, the one that had always been too big for her, and now seemed to dwarf her entirely. She was wearing her good cardigan, the blue one, the one she saved, which told me she'd known I was coming and had made an effort. Her white hair was brushed and pinned, but there was something in her face I hadn't seen the same way over FaceTime. A blurriness around the edges of her attention, as though she were watching the world from slightly farther away than usual. Renata. Her whole face shifted when she saw me, and for a moment she was simply my mother again, the woman who had taught me to read in 2 languages, who had driven me to my law school entrance exams and waited in the parking lot for 4 hours because she hadn't trusted herself to go home and not pace herself to pieces. Renata, you look tired. Did you eat? I kissed her forehead and held her hands. They felt smaller than I remembered. I ate at a rest stop. I'm fine. How are you feeling? Oh, up and down. She waved her free hand in that dismissive way she'd always had. Dorian says I'm doing very well considering. Dorian says. What does Dr. Mehta say? She looked toward the doorway as though Dorian might materialize to help her answer. I haven't seen Linda in a while. Dorian handles the appointments now. It's easier. He knows how to talk to them. You know how I get flustered. My mother had never, in 81 years, been flustered by a doctor. Dorian appeared in the doorway on cue, leaning against the frame with the practiced ease of a man who had learned exactly how much space to take up, without appearing to crowd anyone. I've been helping Elżbieta coordinate her care, he said. She had so many appointments scattered around. It was overwhelming for her. Now everything goes through me and I can brief her on what matters. That's very kind, I said. I heard my own voice, warm, neutral. The voice I used across mediation tables when I needed someone to keep talking. The 3 of us talked for 40 minutes. Or rather, Dorian and I talked. And my mother orbited the conversation, deferring on every substantial question with the same phrases. Dorian handles all of that now. Dorian explained it to me. It made so much sense. Dorian says it's better not to worry about those old arrangements. Those old arrangements. I asked, as casually as I could manage, about her estate planning. Whether she'd spoken to her attorney. Recently, James Whitmore, a man she'd used for 30 years, who had been present when we drafted her original trust together 12 years ago. My mother's expression shifted, not to confusion, but to something more specific. A coached defensiveness, the look of someone who had been told a question was coming and had been given an answer to give. James is very old-fashioned. Dorian found someone who does things in a more modern way, more appropriate for the current situation. The current situation, I repeated. Things change, Renata. You know that. Dorian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and stood smoothly. I'm so sorry. I need to take this. Business. Another warm smile, this one directed at my mother with a particular softness that I recognized as performance. "I'll be back in an hour, Elżbieta. Don't let Renata tire you out." A small laugh. My mother smiled back at him like a woman who had been told repeatedly that this was the appropriate response. The moment I heard the front door close, I was on my feet. I went to the kitchen and pulled open the side drawer. The folder was still there. He'd replaced it. Of course he had. Why wouldn't he? He didn't know who I was yet. Not really. He'd heard about Renata the daughter. He didn't know about Renata the attorney, the 25 years of undue influence litigation, the dozen cases I'd won by finding exactly this kind of folder in exactly this kind of drawer. I lifted it and read the tab. Updated estate documents. Final. The paper inside was a single summary sheet on the letterhead of Roland Fitch, Esquire, an attorney I'd never encountered in 30 years of Pennsylvania and Connecticut practice. The summary used the clinical language of trust administration. The Elżbieta Szymańska Revocable Living Trust has been amended and restated in full. A new primary beneficiary designation supersedes all prior arrangements. Distribution percentages have been revised per the grantor's instructions. The name in the primary beneficiary line had been blacked out with a marker. Neat, deliberate. The kind of redaction that looks administrative but isn't. I photographed every page with my phone. I replaced the folder at exactly the angle I'd found it. I closed the drawer. Then I stood at my mother's kitchen counter holding a cup of someone else's coffee and allowed myself 15 seconds to feel what I felt. Then I put it away. I had work to do. That evening, after Dorian left with a warmth that included a long hand clasp for my mother and a collegial nod for me, I sat with Elżbieta at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. Her tea, the Lipton she'd been buying in the yellow box since 1978, which she kept in the cabinet above the stove and which was still there, I was relieved to see in the same ceramic canister with the painted rooster. I asked her gently when she had first met Dorian. "Oh, 3 years ago. Maybe a little more." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "He came through the village. He was looking at one of the properties on the East End, and we got talking at the Harvest Festival. You know how I am with people." She smiled. "He came for dinner, and then he just kept coming." "And when did he start helping with your finances?" The defensiveness flickered back. "He offered. He saw that I was struggling with the paperwork since your father died. And he offered. It was kind, Renia." "I know." I kept my voice soft. "Did he ever mention his other clients, his firm?" "He works independently. He says the big firms are too impersonal. He prefers to really know the people he helps." "I know. I'll bet he does." "And the trust amendment. Did you sit down with Roland Fitch yourself, or did Dorian take you to the appointment?" She looked at her tea. "Dorian drove me. My eyes, you know, the nighttime driving, of course." "And when you were there, was Dorian in the room with you and Mr. Fitch?" A pause that lasted just a bit too long. "He was there to help explain things. I don't always follow the legal language." "Mama." I reached across and covered her hand. "You used to draft your own contracts for the rental properties. You read everything twice. You knew what a usufruct was before most attorneys did." She pulled her hand back, not roughly, but there was something reflexive in it, a pulling away from a challenge she'd been taught to avoid. "Things change, Renia. I'm not what I was. Dorian says it's natural to need help as we get older, and there's no shame in accepting it. Dorian says. Dorian says. Dorian says. I recognized the cadence. I'd heard it in depositions, in mediation sessions, in the accounts of adult children who sat across from me and described exactly this. A parent who had gradually and then completely outsourced their judgment to a single outside party, who repeated that party's phrases in the party's syntax, who bristled at family inquiry not from their own instincts, but from instructions they'd absorbed so thoroughly they could no longer identify them as external. I squeezed her hand and changed the subject, and listened to her talk about the garden for half an hour, and I was entirely present for it because she was my mother, and she was 81, and she was still there. But the checklist was running underneath everything, as it always did. I knew the legal standard. Every state recognized undue influence in will and trust contests, and while the precise formulation varied, the core elements were consistent. First, the testator's vulnerability. My mother was 81, partially dependent, experiencing cognitive changes that she herself was no longer tracking clearly. Check. Second, the influencer's opportunity, sustained, private, daily access to the vulnerable person. Dorian Hale had been in this house frequently enough to know exactly where my mother filed her important papers, to have his own coffee on her counter, to have a hook for his blazer by her door. Check. Third, active participation in the creation or execution of documents. He had driven her to Roland Fitch's office. He had been in the room. Check. Fourth, a resulting document that departed from the testator's long-established wishes in a way that benefited the influencer. A document that 12 years ago had left this estate equally to her 2 children, and that now, apparently, had a new primary beneficiary whose name had been carefully blacked out on the copy left in my mother's drawer. Check. But it was the subtler signs that told me how far along this had progressed. The borrowed language, not just deference, but actual phrase adoption. The vocabulary of a man explaining things to someone he taught to doubt her own comprehension. The coached defensiveness. The pulling away from my questions as though she'd been shown that my questions were a form of attack. The social geography of the house itself. Dorian's jacket, Dorian's mug, the coffee she'd learned to enjoy, the appointments he managed, the calls he intercepted. 3 years of patient incremental enclosure. I had seen this in courtrooms. I had seen the families who came to me after, holding the documents with shaking hands, asking why they hadn't seen it sooner. I had never once imagined I would be one of those families. I went to bed at 9:30 because my mother's household ran early, and I lay in my childhood bedroom with the slanted ceiling and the window that looked out over the east field. And I opened my laptop. Not because I needed to learn. I knew this material the way I knew my own name, but because I needed the documentation trail to begin somewhere. And tonight was somewhere. I pulled up my own archived files, 25 years of undue influence cases, organized by outcome, cross-referenced by evidence type. Witness testimony from care providers, financial record subpoenas, attorney-client privilege challenges in cases where the influencer had been present at document execution, successful capacity assessments versus post-death challenges. The pattern was always the same. The influencer cultivated access over months or years. They made themselves indispensable, systematically creating dependency in areas where the elderly person had once been fully capable. They accompanied them to medical and legal appointments, controlling the information flow. They encouraged the person to distance themselves from family, not dramatically, but through gentle, persistent reframing. Your daughter is busy. Your son doesn't understand your needs the way I do. We don't want to burden them with details. And then, when the isolation was complete and the dependency was established, the documents changed. Roland Fitch, Esquire. I made a note to run a bar association check in the morning. A solo practitioner I'd never encountered in 30 years of Pennsylvania and Connecticut practice, brought in to replace James Whitmore after 30 years. Not because Whitmore had done anything wrong, but because an attorney who had known my mother for 3 decades would have been very difficult to manipulate into executing a document that dramatically altered her estate plan. You needed a fresh practitioner, someone without context, someone who would take the grantor's apparent competence at face value when presented by a confident, articulate financial advisor who vouched for her wishes. I closed the laptop at 2 in the morning. The house was quiet around me, the old kind of quiet, the kind that comes from plaster walls and long history, and the specific silence of a building that has absorbed a century of family living. My mother was down the hall, 81 years old, still here, still alive, which meant the document wasn't probate yet. It wasn't a sealed outcome, a fait accompli presented to grieving children after the fact. It was a living trust, which meant it could be contested now, amended now, challenged now, while Renata Szymańska was still present to speak for herself if I could find a way to help her do it. That was the direction this ran that was different from every case I'd ever handled. In my practice, I had always been the attorney, which meant I was always the person holding the tools. The families were the ones who came to me late, who had to be told that the evidence was thin, that the testator's death had closed certain windows. This time, I was the family, and my mother was alive. I stared at the ceiling for a long time and listened to the wind work its way along the east window frame the way it had been doing since my childhood. Then I reached for my phone. Yolanda Price had been my forensic document examiner for 15 years. Before that, she'd been an FBI document specialist for 12. She had a gift for finding what wasn't there: the missing revisions, the signature inconsistencies, the dating anomalies that told you a document had been executed under conditions someone had worked hard to obscure. I'd sent her documents from probate cases in 7 states. I'd watched her take the stand and dismantle an opposing attorney's entire case with 4 overhead slides and the specific calm of a woman who had spent 30 years being right. I typed, "I need you. Bring your kit." I put the phone on the nightstand and lay back down. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oaks at the edge of the east field, the ones my grandfather had planted, the ones my mother had climbed as a girl, the ones I had climbed myself on, summer afternoons when this house had been simply home and not an estate with a value I could calculate to the dollar and a document trail I was already mapping in my head. I thought about Dorian Hale, asleep somewhere tonight, with his Oxfords placed just so, and his folder back in the drawer, and 30 years of my family's life already in his sightline. I thought about what he didn't know. Then I closed my eyes and let myself rest for whatever hours remained before the morning came and the real work began. Sylvia Okonkwo's office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian on the main street of Hartwell, 3 blocks from the Ashgrove Manor gates, above a tax preparation service that was closed until February. The building smelled of old wood and radiator heat, and the particular mustiness of a place that had been important for a long time. I liked it immediately. I had spent 2 days researching Sylvia before I called her. Bar admission in Connecticut in 1999. 24 years of probate practice. The last 12 as a solo. She had a reputation in Connecticut legal circles for taking cases other attorneys found too complicated, too emotionally entangled, too unlikely to generate clean billable hours. She had also, I discovered through a Westlaw search, won a contested trust case in Hartford Superior Court 4 years ago that had become a minor landmark in Connecticut undue influence jurisprudence. The influencer in that case had been a home health aide. The testator had been 77. I knew her type. The good kind. She was already behind her desk when her assistant showed me in, and she did not stand or extend pleasantries beyond a nod and a gesture toward the chair across from her. I respected that. We were both attorneys. We both knew what we were here to do. "Tell me what you have," she said. So I told her. I told her about the drawer, the coffee, the Oxfords on the mat. I told her about my mother's borrowed language and coached defensiveness, and the 30-year gap between the woman who used to read her own contracts and the woman who now deferred every question to a man she'd met at a harvest festival. I told her about Roland Fitch, the amended trust summary, the redacted beneficiary line. I put my phone on her desk and showed her the photographs I'd taken. Sylvia listened without interrupting, which was the professional courtesy I'd always appreciated most. She looked at each photograph twice. Then she set the phone down and folded her hands. "You understand what you're asking for," she said. "I'm asking to contest a trust amendment on grounds of undue influence. You're asking for the hardest thing in probate law." She said it without apology. Undue influence is the hardest claim to prove in this area. Judges don't like it. It requires them to find that an elderly person was not, in a meaningful sense, making their own decisions. That cuts against every instinct toward autonomy and dignity for the aged. It's an uncomfortable finding. I know. I had said those exact words to a woman named Paulette Dreyer, who sat across from me in Philadelphia in 2017, holding her dead father's amended will. I've litigated it from the other side of the table. Sylvia looked at me steadily. "Then you know what you need. Pattern, proximity, and proof." She picked up her pen. "Tell me about the medication situation." I told her about the surgery dates I'd found in my mother's paper calendar and the hip replacement 8 months ago that had kept Elżbieta bedridden for 6 weeks. Based on the document dating on the amended trust, Roland Fitch had come to the house during that period. Not my mother to Fitch's office. Fitch to the house. During the worst of her recovery. Sylvia wrote something down without looking up. Pain management protocol after hip replacement in an 81-year-old typically involves opioid analgesics for the first 3 to 4 weeks minimum, combined with anti-anxiety medication for surgical stress. That's a cognitive landscape that would concern any court. And there's documented cognitive decline that predates the surgery, I said. I've already contacted her primary care physician. Dr. Mehta has agreed to initiate a formal assessment. Good. Get those records from the 18 months surrounding the signing. Everything. I can subpoena if necessary. But voluntary disclosure from the physician is cleaner. She paused. You're still listed as a trustee on the original? Joint trustee with my brother. She'd never formally removed us. Or perhaps Fitch advised that it wasn't necessary if the amendment superseded the original document. Sloppy, Sylvia said. It didn't sound like a criticism of Fitch so much as an observation about his confidence level. Men who believed they'd already won tended towards sloppiness. That gives you standing to request the full document. File today. I had already drafted the request on my laptop that morning at the kitchen table, while Dorian, who had appeared at 8:30 with a bag of groceries and a cheerful remark about the cold, made himself at home in the other room. Connecticut has a specific framework, I said. Section 45A, 257. Yes. She looked at me with what might have been the beginning of professional respect. You know what's useful about that statute? Burden shifting. Once you establish a prima facie case, testator vulnerability, opportunity, active participation, inconsistent result, the burden shifts to the proponent of the document to prove it was executed free of undue influence. She set down her pen. Which means that once we have our foundation in place, Dorian Hale has to prove a negative. He has to demonstrate that a woman with early cognitive decline, recovering from surgery on a pharmaceutical regimen, in the daily company of a man who had systematically isolated her from her family, was freely and independently choosing to disinherit her children in his favor. She paused. That is a difficult thing to prove, particularly when she wrote a letter saying otherwise. I had saved that for last. I watched Sylvia's expression change. Not dramatically. She was too experienced for that. But there was a sharpening around her eyes that told me she understood what I'd just said. I told her about the letter, the hidden panel in the library. My great-aunt Martha, who had built the false compartment during the 1950s for reasons our family had never fully understood, but had accepted as the behavior of a woman who'd survived certain things. My mother, who had known about it since childhood and had shown it to me when I was 12, with the solemnity of a state secret. The letter, dated 22 months ago, addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, describing Dorian's escalating pressure, her growing discomfort, her wish that the estate remain in the family. Witnessed and stamped by Agnes Kowalczyk, who had been the village postmistress for 19 years, and whom I had known since I was small. Sylvia was quiet for a long moment. A contemporaneous statement of intent, she said finally, witnessed and dated from a period when her cognition was still largely intact. Yes, that's not a case, Sylvia said. That's a weapon. I drove back to the manor in the cold November light and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The east field was the color of old pewter. The oaks my grandfather had planted stood bare and patient. I thought about what I needed to do next, and in what order, and I put the grief somewhere safe where it could wait, and I went inside. But to understand where we were on day 3, you had to understand the 3 years that had built the trap. The charity auction where Dorian Hale first appeared in my mother's life had been held at the Hartwell Historical Society, which occupied a renovated mill 2 miles from the manor. Agnes Kowalczyk told me this, and my mother had mentioned it herself in a phone call I hadn't paid enough attention to. I met the most charming man at the Whitfield auction. He knew all about the Meissen pieces, Renia. He could date them by the mark. I had been in the middle of a motion hearing when she called. I had said, "That's lovely, Mama," and returned to my papers. Elżbieta Szymańska had spent 40 years accumulating what amounted to a serious collection of Central European decorative arts. The manor was full of it. Meissen porcelain, Bohemian glass. A Biedermeier writing desk in the study that a museum in Prague had once written to inquire about. She had educated herself painstakingly through books and auction catalogs and correspondence with dealers, because that was how she did everything, without assistance, without shortcuts, with total self-sufficiency. Dorian had known exactly which door to knock on. He had appeared at the auction beside a woman named Geraldine Marsh, who was a peripheral figure in the Hartwell social world, and who had described him afterward as a friend from the city, terribly knowledgeable. He had stood with my mother for 40 minutes in front of a display case of Viennese silver, speaking fluently and accurately about hallmarks and assay offices, and the particular characteristics of Austro-Hungarian silversmithing between 1870 and 1918. My mother would have been delighted. My mother would have felt, perhaps for the first time since my father died, that she was in the company of someone who understood what she valued. He had come for dinner 2 weeks later. He had come back the following month, and the month after that. I had pieced this together from my mother's paper calendar, from Agnes's recollections, from a handful of notes my mother had written on the back pages of her household journal, the kind of informal document keeping that estate attorneys learn to cherish, because it predates the influence and therefore reflects the testator's authentic voice. October. D coming Thursday, the Baccarat decanters. January. D drove me to Linda's, very helpful, icy roads. March. D says he can manage the bond statements, such a relief. That last entry had a date. I had photographed it. Here was the thing about Dorian Hale's first year in my mother's orbit. He had not rushed. That was the sophistication of it, the thing that distinguished the calculated from the merely opportunistic. He had spent 12 months being genuinely useful, genuinely charming, genuinely attentive in ways that cost him very little, but accumulated enormous social capital with an elderly woman whose children were in Philadelphia and London, and who had been quietly, genuinely lonely since my father's death 4 years before. He was not stupid. He was patient. He had been studying the estate during those first visits. The art, the furniture, the structure of the property, the layout of the financial situation. All of it assembled through the natural conversational intimacy of a man who had made himself a trusted companion. My mother would have told him everything. She had no reason not to. She was proud of what she'd built. And he was interested. And interest was its own form of flattery. By the end of the first year, he was driving her to appointments. By the middle of the second year, he was accompanying her inside. I know when it shifted, because Agnes told me. About 18 months in, Agnes said, when I stopped by the post office on day 4. I noticed she stopped mentioning calling you before she did things. Before, she'd always say, "I'll ask Renata." Then it stopped. I had written that down too. The document came on day 5 via the records request Sylvia had filed on my behalf. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the email arrived with the scanned attachment. I opened it and I read it. And then I set my phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the east field for a long time. $2 million. The manor appraised at $1,100,000 in the current market. The contents separately appraised 18 months ago at $340,000. The appraisal, I noted, had been arranged by Dorian through a firm I had not yet researched. The municipal bond portfolio, valued at approximately $560,000. 4 generations of accumulated family life catalogued and totaled. Dorian Hale, primary beneficiary. 100% of the residual estate. My brother Tomasz, a token bequest of $15,000 and the right to select 3 personal items from the household contents before distribution. Renata Szymańska-Voss. Nothing. Not a line, not a figure, not an acknowledgement. Simply absent from the document, as though I had never existed in relation to this family, this house, this life. It had been signed on a Tuesday in March, 8 days after my mother was discharged from the hospital following her hip replacement. Roland Fitch and his paralegal had come to the house. The notary was a woman named Dana Simcoe, who worked from Fitch's office address. I photographed the document. I forwarded it to Sylvia. Then I called Dr. Mehta's office and asked whether the cognitive assessment had been scheduled. It had. I asked whether Dr. Mehta would be willing to provide records from the 18 months surrounding March. Her coordinator said she would check. Then I found the bank records. I was still listed on the original trust as a trustee, which gave me access to certain account information through the trust's provisions. Excess Dorian had apparently not thought to terminate because he'd been operating under the assumption that I was an occasionally visiting daughter, not an estate attorney who had drafted the original documents and knew exactly what her standing entitled her to review. The checking account linked to the trust had a new co-signatory as of 6 months ago, Dorian Hale. Added with a signature authorization form that bore my mother's signature, a signature I photographed and forwarded to Yolanda Price with a note asking her to compare it against samples from 2 years prior. $47,000 in withdrawals over 6 months. The memo lines were methodical. Estate Management Services, October. Administrative Coordination, November. Property Oversight Consulting, December. The language of a man who had understood from the beginning that the memo line was the only record that would exist without a subpoena. I added the bank records to the file. I thought about calling Tomasz right then, but I needed the full picture first, or as close to full as I could assemble before he saw it. My brother had always been the family optimist. Not naive exactly, but inclined to find the charitable explanation, the misunderstanding that could be resolved by a frank conversation. He was a software architect who lived in Hammersmith with his husband and their 2 terriers, and he had not practiced law and had not spent a career learning to read rooms and people and documents. He needed to see the architecture of this before he could believe it was a building and not just a collection of unfortunate coincidences. I spent day 6 organizing the timeline. I printed photographs. I cross-referenced dates. I built a chronology that ran from Dorian's first appearance at the Whitfield auction to the bank withdrawal in the most recent month. And I color-coded it by category. Financial records in blue, medical records in green, witness statements in red, documentary evidence in black. It was, I noted, with the detached part of my brain that was still capable of professional observation, even in the middle of this, an unusually clean case. Most undue influence situations were murkier. The influencer more careful, the evidence more circumstantial. Dorian had been confident enough or arrogant enough to leave a trail that a competent attorney could follow in a week. That was interesting. That told me something about how well he thought he'd contained the situation. He'd believed I was simply Renata, the daughter, the visiting professional who called on Sundays and came up for holidays. He had not done his research. On day 8, I invited him for coffee. He arrived at 10 in the charcoal blazer, with his usual ease of movement through the house. My mother was resting. I had gently suggested she sleep in, and she had, because her body was tired, even when her mind was being managed by someone else's agenda. Dorian poured his own coffee from his machine and sat across from me at the kitchen table and performed, with considerable skill, the version of himself that was gracious and warm and slightly paternal toward me. "I'm glad we have a chance to talk," he said. "I think there's been some tension, and I'd hate for that to come between your mother and you." "I've been reviewing the estate documents," I said. "As original trustee, I have standing to request the full amended trust." "I've done that." He held his expression. The warmth became very slightly more deliberate. "Of course. Everything is perfectly in order, Renata. Your mother was very clear about her wishes. She felt, and I want to be honest with you, even if this is uncomfortable, she felt the family had taken this place for granted." I kept my hands loose around my mug. "Tell me more about that." He accepted the invitation with the smoothness of a man who'd been waiting for it. He leaned back in his chair, and something in the warmth shifted to a different register. Not hostile, but certain, the certainty of a man who believed he held every significant card and was about to demonstrate it. "Honestly?" He said it the way people said honestly when they'd rehearsed what came next. "She told me she always felt invisible to you, that you were too busy with your career to ever really see her." The air in the kitchen went very still. I thought about my mother at the bottom of my law school parking lot, waiting for hours. I thought about the phone calls, the weekly calls I had made without fail since my father died. The calls she sometimes cut short because Dorian needed something. I thought about the blue cardigan she had put on when she knew I was coming. I set down my cup. I looked at him steadily across the table. "Thank you, Dorian," I said. That's exactly the kind of statement I needed on record. I placed my phone on the table between us, screen up. The voice recorder had been running for 11 minutes. He looked at the phone. Then he looked at me. And for the first time since I'd walked into my mother's kitchen and found him opening her drawer, the performance slipped. Just briefly, just enough. Then he smiled, and the warmth came back, and he said, "I think it's time to talk to Roland." Roland Fitch's letter arrived 4 days later. It was on cream letterhead, with a Hartford address and a firm tone that had been calibrated to sound authoritative without making specific legal claims. It warned me against further harassment of the testator and attempts to unduly influence Mrs. Szymańska against the terms of her validly executed estate plan. It suggested that any further contact with Elżbieta regarding estate matters could be characterized as interference. I read it twice. Then I called Sylvia. "Save it," she said. "That letter is going to look extraordinary in front of a judge. He's accusing you of doing the thing his client did. Courts notice that." "I know," I said. "How close are we to filing?" 2 days, maybe 3. I'm waiting for the medical records." That evening, I called Tomasz. It was midnight his time, and he answered on the second ring because I had texted first to say it was important. I walked him through the timeline I'd built. I sent him the photographs while we talked. I heard him go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the international connection and everything to do with the man, slowly understanding that the worst version of a situation was the true one. "She couldn't have," he said. "Not Mama, not on her own. She didn't do it on her own. That's exactly the point. But she was always so—" He stopped. "She was. She still is. Underneath it. That's what we're fighting for." Another silence. Then, "When do you need me there?" "I'll tell you when Sylvia files, but start looking at flights." He booked one the next morning. I knew because he texted me a screenshot of the confirmation at 6 a.m., his time, which meant he hadn't slept. Neither had I, for different reasons. Because at 11 o'clock the previous night, my phone had rung with my mother's name on the screen. She had never called me that late. Not in years. "Renia." Her voice was careful in the way that it had been since I arrived. The coached carefulness, the borrowed deliberateness. "I need to ask you to stop. Dorian told me what you're doing. Going to lawyers, asking questions. It's hurtful, after everything he's done for me." I sat on the edge of my childhood bed and looked at the slanted ceiling and breathed. "Mama," I said, "did Dorian ask you to call me?" A pause. "He thought it would be better coming from me." "Okay." I kept my voice the same, warm, level, the voice I had used across every mediation table, the voice I had used to tell clients things they didn't want to hear while leaving the relationship intact. "I hear you. I'm not going to stop, because I love you, and I think you're in a situation that isn't fair to you. But I'm not going to argue about it tonight." "Renia, I love you, Mama. I'm not going anywhere." I hung up and immediately opened my evidence file and made a note. November 14th, Tandy, 58 p.m. call from Elżbieta Szymańska. Stated that Dorian Hale had instructed her to call and ask me to cease legal inquiry. Date, time, duration. Then I set the phone down and let myself feel it. The precise, specific grief of recognizing your mother's voice being used by someone else's script. Then I put it back in its compartment and returned to work. The night before Sylvia filed, I walked through Ashgrove Manor alone. My mother was asleep. The house was quiet in its old way, the radiators ticking, the November wind working along the east windows. I walked through it the way I had as a child, touching the things I'd always touched. The wainscoting my great-grandmother had installed in the front hall, dark oak, nicked in one corner, where I had run a bicycle into it at age 7. The portrait of my grandfather Carol in the hallway, painted in 1962 by a local artist whose name I could never remember. but whose signature I'd memorized, because my mother had told me it was important to know who made things. The kitchen, the drawer, the hook where Dorian's jacket had hung on that first morning, and where nothing hung now because he had been careful, since the voice recording, to be slightly less at home. I went to the library. The false panel was behind the second bookcase from the window, in the section where my great-aunt Marta had kept her Polish language novels. You pressed the lower right corner with 2 fingers and lifted slightly, and the panel swung on a simple pivot hinge. My mother had shown me when I was 12. I had never told anyone. There was no reason Dorian would ever have found it. The letter was still there. I'd found it 3 days ago and photographed it and replaced it, because I wanted to let it rest where it was, until Sylvia was ready, where it was safe, where it had been placed by a woman who knew her own home and trusted her own daughter. A woman who had, somewhere underneath the coach defensiveness and borrowed language and confusion, been trying to reach me across the distance Dorian had engineered between us. My dearest Renata, it began in my mother's handwriting, the handwriting I had known since before I could read, the handwriting that appeared on birthday cards and recipe cards, and the margins of books she'd pressed into my hands. I am writing this because I am unsure what is coming, and I want there to be a record of what I actually want, in case I am not able to say so clearly later. She had described Dorian's escalating pressure over the preceding months, the way he talked about the estate, the way he framed her family, her children, as absent and indifferent, the way she had felt, increasingly, that she was seeing the world through a frame he had built for her. She had written, "I know my mind is not what it was, and I am frightened sometimes that I am being asked to make decisions I cannot fully understand. I do not want this house to leave our family. I never wanted that. Whatever I may sign, that is not what I want." It was dated. It was witnessed by Agnes Kowalczyk, stamped with the post office seal that Agnes had explained when I showed her a copy she had applied at my mother's specific request. Elżbieta had said she wanted it to be official. My mother, who had spent a lifetime knowing how to make things official, had done the one thing Dorian could not have anticipated. She had left the record in a place only her daughter would find. I held the letter for a moment in the library that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the particular silence of a room that had been important for 100 years. Dorian Hale had spent 3 years learning everything about this estate. He had learned the art, the finances, the emotional landscape of a lonely widow. He had learned the drawer where my mother kept her documents, and the doctor who managed her care, and the attorney who would execute his plan. He had not learned about the panel behind the bookcase. He had not learned about me. I replaced the letter carefully, pressed the panel back into place, and went to bed. Tomorrow, Sylvia would file. The Hartford Probate Court building smelled like every courthouse I had ever worked in. Industrial cleaner and old paper, and the particular tension of people waiting to find out what would be decided about their lives. I had sat on this side of the table before, but always as the attorney, never as the family. The distinction was not small. Sylvia had told me to let her run the hearing without interruption, and I had agreed because she was right, and because the hardest professional discipline I had ever exercised was sitting in that room beside my brother, and keeping my hands folded on the table while someone else argued my case. Tomasz had arrived 4 days earlier. I had picked him up from Bradley Airport in the dark, and he had looked tired and jet-lagged and older than I remembered, which I supposed we both were. When we pulled into the driveway of Ash Grove Manor and the headlights swept across the front of the house, he had made a sound that was not quite a word. "I know," I said. "Show me the file," he said. I had shown him the file. He had been quiet for a long time afterward, in the way of a man who had arrived skeptical and left with no skepticism remaining. Then he had poured us both a measure of the Dubrovka my mother kept in the sideboard, and we had sat at the kitchen table, and he had said, "What do you need me to do?" Now he sat beside me in the hearing room in a suit he had bought in London and pressed that morning, and I could feel the controlled stillness in him that matched my own. We had both inherited our mother's posture. Whatever else had happened to her, Elżbieta Szymańska had always known how to sit in a room as though she had a right to be there. Sylvia laid it out with the economy of a person who had done this before and had learned that excessive ornament was the enemy of credibility. She walked the hearing officer through the chronology, the 3-year cultivation, the isolation pattern demonstrated through phone records showing a 74% decline in calls between Elżbieta and family members over the 18 months preceding the signing, the medical records from the recovery period following the hip replacement in February, the surgical notes, the medication log, the attending physician's post-operative summary that listed in the flat bureaucratic language of medicine the combination of oxycodone and lorazepam that had constituted my mother's pharmaceutical reality on the Tuesday in March when Roland Fitch came to the house with his paralegal and his notary and his client's already prepared signature pages. Roland Fitch sat across the room with a newer, more expensive attorney than himself, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. He had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a bar complaint reduction, which meant his own account of the signing process would be carefully worded, carefully limited, and would confirm more than he probably wished. When Sylvia presented the financial records, the co-signatory edition, the $47,000 in withdrawals with their methodical memo lines, I watched the hearing officer's face. She was a woman in her mid-60s with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who had been in this work long enough to be surprised by very little. But the memo lines made her jaw tighten slightly. Estate management services, administrative coordination, property oversight consulting. The language of a man who had understood from the beginning that documentation was its own kind of camouflage. Then Sylvia produced the letter. She had entered it into evidence as Exhibit 14, and she read the relevant portions aloud in the deliberate cadence she reserved for moments when she wanted the words themselves to do the work without editorial commentary. My dearest Renata, I am writing this because I am unsure what is coming. I do not want this house to leave our family. I never wanted that. Whatever I may sign, that is not what I want. The room was very quiet. Fitch's attorney attempted the counter-argument. His client had met with Elżbieta multiple times and had assessed her to be competent. She had expressed clear and consistent wishes. The family's current interference was, he suggested, itself a form of pressure on an elderly woman's autonomy. Sylvia let him finish. Then she produced the retroactive capacity evaluation conducted by Dr. Anand Mehta in conjunction with a neuropsychologist from Yale New Haven Hospital, which documented moderate cognitive decline consistent with early-stage vascular dementia, a condition with an established progression timeline indicating that the decline had been present and measurable at the time of signing. She noted that Fitch had not requested a capacity evaluation before executing the amended trust. She noted that he had allowed an interested party, a man who stood to inherit the entire estate, to be present in the room during the signing. She noted that Connecticut courts under Section 45-257 and the body of case law that had developed around it recognized that once a prima facie case of undue influence was established, the burden shifted to the document's proponent. She looked at Fitch's attorney when she said it. He was writing something on his legal pad. The hearing officer asked several questions. She asked about Agnes Kowalczyk's notarial witnessing of the letter, which Sylvia confirmed was valid under Connecticut notarial standards. She asked about the timeline between the hip surgery and the signing. She asked whether there was evidence of prior expressed wishes inconsistent with the amended document. Sylvia produced the original trust, co-drafted by my mother and James Whitmore 12 years earlier, distributing the estate equally between both children. She produced 3 separate statements from Elżbieta's former friends, women from her church circle and her historical society. Women Dorian had quietly edged out of her life over 2 years, attesting to conversations in which Elżbieta had spoken about Ashgrove Manor remaining in her family without ambiguity or qualification. The hearing lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the hearing officer said she would issue her preliminary ruling within the week. Tomasz and I drove back to Hartwell, mostly in silence. Somewhere past the Farmington River, he said, "She hid the letter for you specifically, didn't she? Not just somewhere safe. Somewhere you would know." "Yes." He was quiet for another mile. "She knew you would come. She knew I would look in the right place when I did." The preliminary ruling arrived on a Thursday afternoon by email to Sylvia, who called me while I was standing in the east field watching 2 crows work through the frozen grass with methodical efficiency. The amended trust was void. The original trust was reinstated. The court found sufficient grounds on the totality of the evidence presented to determine that the amended document had been executed under conditions consistent with undue influence and that it did not represent the testator's free and independent expression of her wishes. Roland Fitch would receive a separate communication from the Bar Association's Professional Conduct Committee. I stood in the east field and felt something unknot in my chest that I had not fully realized was knotted. Then I went inside and made tea and sat with my mother and told her. Elżbieta listened with her hands around her mug. Her face went through several things I did not try to name. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The letter," she said finally. "You found it." "I found it." She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman confirming something she had arranged and trusted and waited on for 2 years. "I did not know if I would be able to say the things out loud," she said. "When he was here, everything got confused. But I knew that you would see clearly what I could not." She paused. "You always saw clearly, Renia. I used to worry it made you lonely." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Not lonely, just careful." She patted my hand. "Same thing, for women like us." Dorian came the following Saturday. He had been notified by a deputy sheriff that he must vacate the secondary residence he had effectively been using, a guest cottage on the east edge of the manor property. 3 weeks into my investigation, I had discovered that my mother had made it available to him at his suggestion. No documentation, no rent. Simply an arrangement that had accrued like so many of his arrangements. Through familiarity and patience and the slow erosion of the word no. I had packed his belongings myself, not out of vindictiveness, but out of control. I had wanted to know exactly what was in the cottage. I had photographed every room before I touched anything, and noted the 3 framed photographs of Ash Grove Manor's exterior that he had hung on the cottage walls, as though the house were already something he was entitled to contemplate as his own. I had noted the real estate brochures in his desk drawer, from a luxury property auction house in New York. I had noted the detailed photographs on his phone, which he had left charging on the kitchen counter. Tomasz, who had a facility with these things that his legal training had never required, had confirmed from the phone's visible camera roll thumbnail that the images appeared to include close-up photographs of the Meissen pieces, the Biedermeier desk, and the Bohemian glass. A man who had been planning to liquidate what he had assumed he was about to own. I had put his boxes in the front hall, 4 of them neatly stacked. And then I had stood in the doorway when he came up the path, because I had wanted to be the first thing he saw. He looked the same. Good blazer, different one, navy this time. The practiced ease slightly diminished, like a performance running low on conviction. He looked at me, and then at the boxes, and then at me again. And I watched him calculate. Renata. He found the warmth from somewhere, the last reserves of it. I hope we can be civil about this. I said nothing. I waited. You realize, he said, none of this had to happen. I actually cared about this family. I gave your mother 3 years of my life. His voice had moved from warm to something more pressurized, a man who had run out of his preferred approach and was shifting to the next register. You owe me. She owes me. That is not nothing. 3 years. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone, coached and careful. I thought about $47,000 in memo line withdrawals and real estate brochures. And a Tuesday in March, when a notary came to the house, while my mother was 8 days out of surgery and still on 2 medications that muffled the edges of everything she thought and felt. The court disagrees, I said. So does the postmistress. I stepped back and gestured toward the boxes. He held my gaze for another moment with something that had stopped being warmth entirely and had become, underneath its last pretenses, something colder and less interesting. Then he picked up the first box and carried it to his car without another word. I watched him make 4 trips. When he drove away, I closed the front door of Ash Grove Manor and stood in the hallway under my grandfather's portrait and let the quiet of the house settle around me like something earned. The civil claim for financial elder abuse took 4 months to resolve. Under Connecticut General Statutes Section 17 BE-451 and its associated civil provisions, the $47,000 in unauthorized withdrawals constituted grounds for damages. Dorian's attorney, the expensive one, not Fitch, who had enough problems of his own, negotiated quietly rather than litigate. He returned $38,000. The remaining $9,000 was the cost of his calculation, that a partial settlement was better than a courtroom. I wrote it in my notes as the cost of the lesson and let it go. 6 months after the hearing, Sylvia called me on a Tuesday morning while I was in the garden at the manor, helping my mother decide whether the frost-damaged roses on the south wall were worth saving. "He wants a mediated settlement conference," Sylvia said. I could hear the particular restraint in her voice that she used when something amused her professionally. "He has filed some personal property claims. Apparently he believes certain items he gifted to the estate during his tenure constitute recoverable assets. He needs a release signed. He needs my signature. And Tomasz's? Yes." My mother was looking at a rose cane with the focused attention she brought to things she loved. I watched her for a moment. "Tell him I will mediate," I said. "My terms, my timeline. Full written release of all future claims against the estate, my mother, Tomasz, and me. Not negotiable as a precondition." A pause. "He will agree to that." I know. He did agree. We met in Sylvia's office on a grey February morning. Dorian and his attorney on one side of the conference table, Sylvia and I on the other. And I watched him sign his name to a document that transferred his last remaining leverage over our family to the file cabinet, where it would live in perpetuity as a reminder of what happened when someone underestimated a woman who had spent her career in exactly this room. He did not look at me when he signed. I did not require him to. In the aftermath, working with Sylvia to rebuild and fortify my mother's restored trust, I thought about every family who had ever sat across from me in Philadelphia with documents they had received too late. I thought about what those families could have had if the protections had been built into the original estate plan rather than litigated into existence after the damage was done. We built them into my mother's trust with the care of people who knew exactly which locks were necessary and why. The first provision required that any future amendment to the trust be executed only after Elżbieta met independently with the drafting attorney, alone, without any beneficiary, interested party, or person who might stand to gain from the change present in the room. Not in the waiting area, not in the parking lot, not available by phone. Alone, so that the attorney's assessment of her capacity and freedom from influence could not be contaminated by proximity to the person who might benefit. The second was a notification requirement with teeth. Any proposed amendment required written notice to both Tomasz and me at least 30 days before execution. Not as a veto. The trust was my mother's, and her autonomy was the thing we were protecting, not circumventing. But as a check, a window of time in which family could ask questions, request their own meeting with the attorney, or simply ensure that what was being signed was consistent with the person we knew. The third was a videotaped signing ceremony. Not elaborate, not theatrical, simply a contemporaneous record of Elżbieta on camera in her own voice, explaining her wishes and confirming her understanding. A document could be questioned. A video of a clear-eyed woman explaining her reasoning in her own words was considerably harder to argue against. The fourth was an independent professional co-trustee, a trust company with no personal relationship to the family, whose fiduciary duty ran to the trust itself, and whose quarterly review process created an institutional check on any single person's ability to redirect the estate's trajectory. And the fifth, the one that felt most personal, the one that felt most like what my mother had already understood when she hid that letter in the library, was a formal letter of instruction. A document separate from the trust itself, in which Elżbieta expressed her values and her reasoning and her wishes in plain language, updated annually, signed and witnessed by two people with no interest in the estate. Not a legal instrument on its own, something better, a record of her mind, her intentions, her voice. The kind of document that if someone ever tried to claim that Elżbieta Szymańska had wanted something other than what she had always wanted, would make them face the woman herself, in her own handwriting, saying otherwise. My mother had understood this instinctively. She had built her own version of it with a fountain pen and a trip to the post office, and a hiding place she had kept for 60 years. We were simply making it official. By spring, Tomasz had returned to London. The roses on the south wall had been determined salvageable by someone who knew more about roses than either of us. And my mother had begun meeting weekly with a geriatric care specialist through Yale New Haven's outreach program. Her cognition, Dr. Mehta had noted at the 3-month follow-up, showed modest but meaningful improvement across several markers. The improvement was consistent with what happened, the neuropsychologist explained, when chronic social isolation and psychological stress were relieved. When a person was allowed to simply be themselves again, in their own home, with people who knew them. The kitchen drawer had a small padlock on it now. My mother's idea entirely. She had bought it herself at the hardware store on the main street of Hartwell and installed it with a screwdriver while I watched. When she was done, she had held up the key with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. "For important papers," she said. "For important papers," I agreed. We had tea every Sunday now. Not on the phone, in person, at the kitchen table, the good table, the one her mother had brought in pieces from Krakow and assembled in this kitchen before I was born. I had moved back to the manor properly, or mostly properly. I kept an apartment in Philadelphia for the work that still came in. The referrals I still accepted because 25 years of practice did not simply stop, and because I had discovered that the work meant something different now that I had been on the other side of it. On an afternoon in late winter, when the light came through the library's tall windows at the angle that turned everything amber and ancient, I went to the bookcase and pressed the lower right corner with 2 fingers and lifted. The panel swung open. The hollow was empty. The letter had been entered into evidence, had been copied and filed, and ultimately returned to me in a manila envelope by Sylvia's assistant, with a note that said simply, "Keep this safe." It lived now in a fireproof box in my bedroom, which was perhaps not as elegant a hiding place as a secret panel in a 19th century library, but which had the advantage of being on record. I looked at the empty space for a moment. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, lined with old cedar from some forgotten original purpose. My great-aunt Marta had made it during the 1950s and had never explained why, and her silence on the subject had always struck me as the discretion of a woman who understood that sometimes you needed a place to put things that the wrong people must not find. My mother had used it for the same reason, 2 generations later. She had written her most essential truth in her own handwriting, had walked it to the post office to be officially witnessed, had placed it in the dark behind the books where only someone who had been taught the secret could find it. I closed the panel and ran my palm along the shelf of old novels. Prus, Iwaszkiewicz, Dąbrowska, names I had learned to read before I learned to read English. The books were cool and slightly rough under my hand, the texture of 100 years of someone caring about something enough to keep it. From the kitchen, I heard the small sounds of my mother making tea, the particular knock of the ceramic canister on the counter, the particular complaint of the kettle as it began to heat. Sounds as specific and irreplaceable as a signature. I thought about the families I had represented in Philadelphia, the ones who came to me too late, with documents already signed and estates already moved, and mothers already buried, asking what could still be done. I thought about what I had always known professionally and had now learned in the bones, that the best protection was not litigation. Litigation was the remedy. The protection was the architecture, the independent attorney meeting, the notification window, the recorded ceremony, the institutional check, the letter in your own voice that said, "Here is what I believe, here is what I want, here is who I am," so that no one can tell you otherwise on my behalf. My mother had known this without being taught it. She had built the best protection she could with the tools she had at the time. I walked out of the library and down the hallway, past my grandfather's portrait, past the wainscoting with the old bicycle dent in the lower corner, through the front hall where Dorian's 4 boxes had waited for him on a Saturday in November. The kitchen was warm. The tea was made. Elżbieta was at the table in her blue cardigan, the good one, and she looked up when I came in with the expression she had always had when I came home, something between relief and satisfaction, the look of a woman who had been right about something she had been waiting for. I pulled out my chair and sat down. Some things the estate remembers even when the people forget. The bones of a house that has held a family for 100 years. The hollow behind the panel. The handwriting on a letter placed in the dark by a woman who trusted that her daughter would know where to look. I picked up my cup. Outside, the winter light was going gold across the east field, and the oaks my grandfather had planted stood bare and patient and entirely certain of spring.